Okay, welcome back everyone. Today we are taking a look at a really fascinating game that Korchnoi played all the way back in 1957. It was a Benko Gambit, and I thought that this setup that Korchnoi played with the white pieces was very instructional for club players because I think it's quite easy to learn and there are some very easy to follow plans here for white. I know that a lot of players with the white pieces really struggle against the Benko Gambit, so let's learn a really simple setup that Korchnoi perfects. In this game, Korchnoi has the white pieces and he starts with d4, knight f6, c4, and c5. So we are heading down into a Benko Gambit. We have d5 from Korchnoi and b5, the start of the Benko Gambit. Korchnoi takes the pawn, and of course we have a6 here from black. That is the point of the Benko Gambit. He is sacrificing his pawn in order to open up the A and the B files, where he'll have his heavy pieces lined up, and the combination of the heavy pieces down the A and the B file together with the dark squared bishop on G7 raining down this long diagonal actually creates a lot of pressure. So in the game, Korchnoi takes the pawn on A6 and black retakes with the bishop. Now, I myself struggled quite a bit with the white pieces against the Benko Gambit when I was much younger. And I remember that one of the things that made me start to play more successfully against this opening was with all of my other openings as white, I was used to the one applying pressure, trying to push, because we have the white pieces, right? We need to demonstrate our advantage. With the Benko Gambit, it's a bit different. And I want to underscore the second word of that opening name, Benko Gambit. We have accepted a pawn in this opening. Black has played a gambit. And so what does that mean? Now, in these types of positions, when black has played a gambit and we have accepted it, the roles have somewhat reversed. It's almost like we are playing black and the black player is playing with the white pieces. He has sacrificed a pawn in exchange for piece activity. Now, a lot of piece activity and open lines is something that we usually associate with the white player because of that advantage of the opening move. It's usually the white side in a lot of openings that has extra mobility, extra piece activity. But this is a gambit and we have accepted the gambit, so the roles have kind of reversed. And I remember when I was much younger and struggling against this opening, it was because I was over-pressing. I was thinking to myself, hang on, I am white. I should have an advantage here. I need to press and push forward and demonstrate my advantage. But once I started to realize that, hey, I've actually accepted material here. This is a gambit that's being played. The philosophy and how you think about the position somewhat changes, right? So let's go through this game and I'll show you how to think about things in that manner. In that we're kind of treating things now as though we're playing with the black pieces, looking to equalize and stabilize the position. And then once we've stabilized the position, that's when we start to spring to life with our pieces and launch our own attack. Okay, so after bishop to a6, we have knight to c3, just developing very naturally. d6 from black, making sure that white doesn't push forward with his d-pawn to create some chaos there. Knight to f3, so both knights here have developed very naturally onto f3 and c3. Nothing special there. One of the hallmark moves of black in the Benko Gambit, he's looking to get his bishop onto that long diagonal and cause some absolute mayhem for white. And g3, so this is the setup that I really like here that Korchnoi is playing. It's very simple. We don't play any move with the e-pawn. We leave it on e2 for the time being, which means that we hang on to our light squared bishop and we get to castle as well. Bishop to g7, bishop to g2, castles and castles. Very straightforward so far. Knight to d7. Now, this might seem like a very natural and passive type of move, just simply developing, but actually the knight from d7 has a lot of ideas in the Benko Gambit actually. First of all, the knight can go either way. Actually, it's got 3 locations it can go to. And you might think to yourself, hang on, well I only see kind of like 2 valid squares. Well, there's a third important one actually. One of the main ideas of the Benko Gambit is to get the queen out to a5, where she x-rays the pawn on d5, which is the forwardmost point of white's position. With the queen on a5, x-raying that pawn, black can also get the knight to b6. And in that position, we can see that the queen and the two knights are placing a huge amount of pressure on that point on d5. And so all that black needs to do with his queen on a5 is to push forward c5 to open up the queen laterally to target the d5 point. That is one of black's kind of hallmark plans that they try to play in the Benko Gambit, but it's not the only plan. The push from c5 to c4 does a few things. Not only does it open up the queen laterally to put pressure onto d5, it also gives black that c5 square. So we can imagine if this pawn has pushed forward from c5 to c4, that square is suddenly available now. So remember how I said that this knight actually has 3 potential homes? b6, e5, and c5, because in many positions, that pawn has pushed forward and vacated the c5 square. Okay, so now we have a bit of an understanding of some of the things that black might want to do, all in combination, of course, with his heavy pieces down the A and the B file. So what does white do? Okay, so first of all, we have queen to c2, and the reason for that is we'd like to protect the d5 point with our rook. Now, if you remember that plan that we were just talking about, queen to a5, knight b6, lots of pressure on this d5 point, we as white want to protect that point ourselves as well. And we know that the queen is not a really good defender. So let's get the queen out of the way and guard that point instead with one of our rooks. Okay, so we have queen to c2. And now in this game, black plays queen to c7, which is not the most common move. As mentioned before, queen to a5 is a bit more active and a bit more direct in what black is trying to do, but this is a bit more of a nuanced approach, queen to c7. Okay, so Korchnoi plays rook to d1, overprotecting his pawn on d5, and now we have rook to b8. His heavy pieces are nicely positioned now on the A and the B file, with lots of pressure. And now in this position here, we have an important move from white, and that is h3. Why is this an important move? If we go back to this position here, we can see that what black would really like is to unleash his bishop. So this bishop on g7 has the potential to be an absolute monster, but this knight on f6 is kind of getting in the way. We have a lot of active ideas for the knight on d7. We can go to b6 and start pressuring d5. We can push forward c5, c4 and jump into c5. So this knight on d7 actually has a lot of active plans. But this knight on f6, there aren't that many creative ideas for that knight to get involved. So the best thing that black can actually do in this position is to simply trade off that piece for one of white's minor pieces and open up that diagonal for the black bishop. One of the ways that black tries to do this is to route the knight from f6 to g4 and then on to e5. So this maneuver here, knight f6 to g4 to e5, looking to exchange white's knight on f3. So that is one of black's common techniques that he likes to deploy in this position. That is why white plays h3 to prevent that plan from black. Black plays knight to b6. It's quite a nice move actually. It's vacating the d7 square so that his f6 knight can go to d7 and now go to e5 and exchange itself off. So with the inclusion of h3, it means that plan to g4 is not possible. So let's take another route as black and get our knight into e5 and exchange ourselves off. So that is one of the ideas of knight to b6. From d7, the knight that was on f6, suddenly it can start thinking about jumping into c5 if black plays c5 to c4 himself. So there's a lot of things happening here for black. And I know we've been talking a lot about black's plans here and all of the ideas that he has. And this is, once again, just reinforcing that point that I had before. The philosophical understanding of your role as white in this opening. We have accepted a gambit. We are up a pawn here. So, of course, naturally, it's going to be black that has a lot of these active plans. And we need to think of ourselves as we, the white player, are actually kind of playing as black and trying to equalize and stabilize the position. yes, for the time being, we're going to be talking about a lot of active plans that black has because we have accepted the gambit. Okay, so in this position here, white plays knight to d2. And you might think to yourself, well, hang on, my rook was important there guarding that point on d5. And now I've blocked the rook, but in doing so, we've also opened up our light square bishop to guard that point. So d5 is still well under control. And so why was this move knight to d2 important? Well, there's a few reasons. First of all, black has signaled to us that he would like to potentially exchange off his knight that is currently on f6 via e5, right? Where he could have taken the knight on f3 and alleviate some of that space disadvantage that he has by exchanging pieces. Now, by moving our knight that was on f3 away, we are doing two things. First of all, we can see for the time being that black has a lot of firepower on the queen side, right? By moving our knight from f3, we are getting closer to the action on the queen side, where we have a lot of pressure being placed upon us, and we are no longer on f3, which means the knight coming to e5 is no longer threatening to exchange itself off, okay? Because there's no piece that it can capture on f3. Okay, so after knight to d2, we have knight d7 from black. We have rook to b1. And I just want to go back to this position here because it's an important one to understand. You might see in this position that the bishop on a6 is hitting the pawn on e2, and the pawn on e2 at the moment is only guarded by the knight on c3. And black can very easily snap that knight off the board. So what's happening here is white simply dropping a pawn by playing rook to b1. After rook b1, can't black just take the knight and then take the pawn on e2? Isn't black just winning a pawn? Well, he's not. And the reason for that is very simple. And this is a common pattern that you need to be aware of in the Benko Gambit as white. One of black's tender points in the Benko Gambit, especially when the queen has been moved, such as here now, to c7 or to a5, is that the e7 pawn is tender. We can see now that there is nothing guarding e7. So in this position, actually, the simple rook to e1 actually recollects the e pawn because black would need to move his bishop out of the way. And then we come in with our rook. And this is a very nice and active position here for white. So back in this position here, we can see that actually black capturing on c3 and then taking the pawn on e2 is not a threat that we need to respond to. So that is why rook b1 is a very nice move actually, because white realizes that this whole plan with black taking on e2 is not a threat. Okay, so after rook to b1, we have knight to b8 with a lot of pressure now on the queen side. We have b3. Looking to get our bishop fianchettoed onto b2 and queen to a5. So we can see now that with the queen on a5, we have pressure with the queen and the bishop targeting the c3 knight, which is currently hanging. So simply bishop to b2 to guard that knight. And notice that the bishop now blocking the protection of a2 is not an issue. You might think, well, can't black just take the knight and then collect the pawn? Well, no, you can't for a number of reasons. First of all, if black takes the knight on c3, taking back with the bishop will open up the queen's protection on a2, but also taking back with the queen means that black doesn't have time to take on a2 because we have a checkmate threat on g7 with the queen and the bishop lined up like that. So bishop to b2, simply guarding the knight. Now we have c4. This is one of those trademark Benko Gambit moves. And the main idea of this move is, well, there's two of them really. As mentioned before, we are opening up our queen laterally. So this puts a little bit more pressure on d5. But more importantly, pushing c5 to c4 has given us this juicy square as black, right? That is the main idea. Okay, so what do we do here as white? Do we need to react? Do we need to do anything? Is black even threatening anything? The first thing that we need to point out is that taking that pawn is not a good idea. And why is that? Remember this pressure here. We have the queen and the bishop hitting the knight. We guarded that threat on the last move by moving our bishop to b2. So this bishop is playing an important role in guarding the c3 knight. So if we take the c4 pawn with our b pawn, it opens up the b file. That means that black can actually take the bishop with his rook a temporary exchange sacrifice after we retake the rook, then black is picking up the knight, right? So this is a very favorable situation for black. So we don't want to allow that. So if we go back to this position here, we can clearly see that taking that pawn is not a good option. And the same thing happens if we take with the knight, because black will simply take the knight, and after we retake, we get the same type of sequence here with black essentially getting those two pieces in exchange for the rook. So if we can't take the pawn then with our pawn or with the knight, it means that we need to do something else. Taking that pawn either with the b3 pawn or with the knight on d2 aren't possible because we have a tactical issue with our bishop on b2. And I really like this move now. Korchnoi simply plays bishop to a1, and I like it for a number of reasons. We just explained how we have a tactical issue with the bishop on b2 preventing us from taking that pawn. Well, Korchnoi is saying, well, I have now solved my tactical issue. You can't sack the exchange on b2 anymore. So now in this position here, white is indeed threatening to simply pick up that pawn, and white would then be 2 pawns up. So that is why in this position here, black took the pawn on b3 because white was threatening to take it, and white retakes with his knight, hitting the queen. And so the queen drops back to c7 with some X-ray pressure against white's queen on c2, which is currently undefended. And so there's a lot of X-ray contact between the pieces now, so the position is starting to get a little bit more lively. We have knight to d4 now, and this is one of the typical ideas that you need to keep in mind as white. Whenever black has played that move, c5 to c4, it is a strong idea for black, but it's a double-edged sword. That pawn that was on c5 here, if I just grab this guy here, that pawn that was on c5 was playing an important role in guarding the d4 square. But since he pushed that pawn forward, that d4 square is accessible to the white pieces now. So getting a knight into d4 means that we can suddenly launch ourselves into c6. And getting a knight onto c6 would be absolutely crippling for black. So knight to d4 here, a very strong move. We have rook to b1, and white retakes with the queen, getting herself off that X-ray from the black queen on c7. We have rook to b8, hitting the queen, and queen to c1 now. Now, not on c2 because she's somewhat loose there, but on c1, the queen is a bit more stable. And now in this position here, white is really ready to jump into c6, which would be completely devastating because he'd be hitting both the rook on b8 and with pressure on e7. So that would be a really difficult position for black to hang on to. So here, black bites the bullet and gives up his beautiful dark squared fianchettoed bishop for the knight on d4. So we have bishop takes d4 and Korchnoi retakes with the rook. And now we can start to see the challenges that black is going to have with his position. His dark squared bishop, not only was it a really strong piece in how he pressured and attacked white's center and queen side, it was actually a very important piece to guard the black king, right? Because we have our pawns on light squares, and that bishop was really needed to plug the holes around the black king. And look at this bishop on a1. Danger, danger. So we can see that the black king is now feeling a little bit naked over there. Okay, so what does black do here? He plays a really interesting move actually. He takes the pawn on e2. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work. And I know what you might be thinking to yourself, well, of course I know why it doesn't work, because the knight can take the bishop, and then if queen takes queen, I simply retake the queen with my knight and I'm up a piece. Well, actually that's not why this move doesn't work. And actually, if white were to go for that sequence, black is actually back in the game. Let me show you. If white were to take the bishop, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, and you think, well, hang on, we're up a piece here, we're winning as white. Well, actually, rook to b1, and the problem is that you've got both the bishop and the knight under attack here. We would really love to play something like knight to b3 here, but the knight is pinned against the king. So black is completely back in the game here. So taking that bishop back here is not a good option. So while this move somewhat loses, actually it's not because of knight takes e2. So black has indeed snagged a pawn. We can't take that bishop back, but black is still losing. Can you see why? Well, in this game, Korchnoi played the very cool, calm and collected king to h2, which is a very cold-blooded move. I won't show the exact engine continuation that the engine wanted to play instead of king to h2 because we're going to see the same type of combination anyway. But have a look at this cold-blooded king to h2 now. And now the point is that, let's say black wastes a move like h5. Now we can take the bishop because after queen takes queen, knight takes, this rook move down to b1 doesn't do anything because knight to b3 guards the knight and protects the bishop. So that cold-blooded king to h2 here from Korchnoi, just saying, well, hang on, I'm now threatening to win your bishop and you have to waste the tempo to protect that piece. And in that time that you waste protecting your bishop, I'm going to just destroy you on the dark squares. So he moves his bishop back to a6. He had to. The piece was just hanging there on e2. Now we have queen to h6, looking at getting into all kinds of dark square shenanigans here. And in this position, there are two really strong ideas for white. We can see that this bishop on a1, x-raying g7 with the queen touching that square as well is a really powerful idea. We can imagine that if we can somehow vacate both of these squares off that diagonal, there could be a lot of pressure there. So that's idea number one. Idea number two is, hello, we have pressure on h7. If we simply get our rook across to h4, we have a lot of pressure here. Yes, black would be able to guard that point with one of these knight moves, but that is one piece out of the way. If we can get the other piece out of the way, then suddenly it's g7 under attack again. So a lot of really powerful threats here from white. In this position, black played knight to f8. He was worried about that idea with the rook swinging across. So he thinks, okay, well, let me just first get h7 under control. But in this position here, we have rook to h4 anyway. So the next piece of the attack is just simply to get the knight out and it'll be pretty much game over. Black plays queen to b6. He's now targeting f2 and trying to get some sort of counterplay like that. But now we simply have knight to e4. We are threatening checkmate in one. Something has to be done about that. Black plays the only available move really. He plays f6 to try to block that diagonal. But now we simply have bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, knight takes f6 check. The king can't step into the corner of the board because we have multiple checkmate threats actually. If the king goes to the corner, we can simply pick up the knight. That's for starters. But we can also actually do this cute checkmate. We've got queen takes h7, sacrificing the queen, knight takes queen, and rook takes knight would also be a checkmate. So the king absolutely cannot go into the corner of the board here. That is why in the game he played king to f7. And after king to f7, Korchnoi simply plays rook to f4, lining up his rook against the black king. And in this position, actually, black resigned. And why is that? Why did he resign? Can black simply just continue to run with his king? Well, if he tried to do that, we have the very simple knight to g8 check. By moving that knight, we have opened up our queen to get involved into the action. On king to d7, we have queen to g7 check. And there's pretty much nothing that black can do here. If he tries to go to the back rank, we simply checkmate with the rook. If he tries to interpose with the knight, then we simply scoop that up with the queen. It's going to be checkmate in a few moves here. So absolutely devastating attack here, and rightly so for black to resign after rook to f4. So what a very interesting game that Korchnoi demonstrated to us in terms of how to first neutralize the pressure that black has in the Benko Gambit, and then how he unveiled his own attack against the black king once that dark squared bishop was exchanged. Okay, thanks everyone for watching the video, and I hope to catch you in the next one.